Cool. So up next we have the lovely Clem. Wonderful. First, we've had him at the atelier on numerous occasions back in the day. Independent coach, and he's going to talk to us all about giving feedback.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marcus. Oh. That was unexpected. So applause at the beginning. You've not heard it yet. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I was wondering, do you have a minute? I've got some feedback I'd like to share with you. Now, there is a sentence that is guaranteed to fill anyone with dread. And I'm going to start by telling you a story about one of my experiences. So, back in the midst of time, well, actually, probably around 2007, I was working as a software development manager for a financial services firm. And on my way to a meeting of some sort, I spotted my boss in the corridor. He clocks me, hesitated for a minute, and then uttered those words. Clem, do you have a minute? I've got some feedback I wanted to share with you. Instant anxiety. Immediately, thoughts are running through my brain. What have I done wrong? I'm feeling really nervous. But of course, I say, sure, no problem. And we duck into a meeting room. Clem, just wanted to say, you're doing really well, but you need to be tougher. Your team speak really highly of you, but, well, yeah, you need to be tougher, really. But overall, good job. Anyway, got to go. And with that, he charges off to his next meeting. Tougher? What? Yeah, anxiety now gives way to confusion. What on earth did he mean by tougher? Well, it could have meant a number of things. Perhaps I needed to work out more. Okay, probably not that one. Maybe it was to act like a Victorian mill owner and expect all my team to work ridiculous hours in terrible conditions. Or maybe it was to channel my inner Gordon Ramsay and become more shouty and sweary. And what I didn't realise at the time was that my boss had just served me a feedback sandwich, otherwise known as the shit sandwich. Possibly the most famous feedback recipe of all time. Quick show of hands, who has had a feedback sandwich before, a shit sandwich, or knows what it is? Yeah, pretty much everyone. So what's my point really? That giving feedback and receiving feedback is hard. Most people are really wary of doing it. And if they have to, they either tend to kind of over-index on being nice, on sort of softening the feedback to kind of avoid hurting the other person's feelings. The challenge, though, is that can be confusing, as it was in my case here, or maybe they just miss that it's feedback altogether. They just think you're talking at them. Or potentially people believe you've got to be really direct, really candid, and then they risk kind of triggering people's defense mechanisms. So people either shut down or get angry or possibly even upset, and ultimately they miss the message that you want to share. A 2019 Gallup survey hints at the kind of impact of this. Only 26% of employees strongly agreed that the feedback they received actually helped them do better work. So clearly there is more work to do in this area. So my aim today is to share some kind of alternative recipes for both giving and receiving feedback, which I found are more effective. But also crucially how these are kind of part of an overall kind of menu for a better feedback culture. You might be wondering what I mean by recipes. I really think of recipes as sort of simple patterns, a list of kind of ingredients and instructions that, just like a cooking recipe, you follow pretty carefully to start with, but over time they become familiar and you can kind of make them your own. However, before we kind of get into looking at the recipes, we need to lay the table, if you'll excuse the metaphor. So just like trying to eat a sandwich on the go is likely to result in indigestion, if we kind of try and build up a feedback culture without having thought about a few preconditions first, it's not likely to result in the best outcomes. And there are three crucial things I wanted to kind of share with you today. So first up, psychological safety. So obviously a big topic in its own right, and we haven't really got time to delve that much into it today. But here is a really kind of common definition of psychological safety. So psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And feedback is typically a mixture of all four of those things. So really, if you haven't got psychological safety in place, it's going to be very hard to encourage a culture where feedback kind of flows and is actually useful. Secondly, be clear on the intent for what increasing feedback is all about. So in my personal view, feedback is about helping people to grow and improve, and also to create an effective learning environment in which teams can kind of perform to the best of their abilities. Feedback that's geared, for example, just towards grading people's performance or for kind of annual promotional cycles, for example, isn't really actually going to change things that much in terms of building a positive culture. And thirdly, while feedback is important, it's not the only tool. People don't just learn through feedback, they also learn through copying kind of great examples by looking at observing what other people are doing and building on that. So if I bring in our metaphor again, if you wanted to be a great chef, you would sample great food. You would go to restaurants for inspiration and to kind of find out what other people are doing. In the world of tech, where I used to work at a tech consultancy, for example, we had things like internal mini-conferences and communities of practice, which allowed people to see what other teams were doing and allow teams to share their work. And we also encouraged people to go and spend time with other teams or even on different client accounts, so that they got an opportunity to kind of observe and share knowledge as well, not just rely on feedback. So, we've laid the table. Sorry, quick question.
Can I just ask about the great examples thing? When you're saying that, are you not worried that people are going to start comparing themselves rather than providing examples of what they're doing so they can go, I need to improve that? To me, if someone said, oh, I want you to be more like so-and-so, that would solve a whole load of problems for me.
Yeah, so I'm not suggesting kind of saying, oh, this is brilliant, you must be more like this, but having them around, being able to absorb that. So by people sharing their work and kind of saying, oh, wow, that looks interesting. So more in that spirit, absolutely. So we've laid the table for a better kind of feedback culture, and we know we want to provide feedback in a way that's better than a slightly crappy sandwich. So how do we help people to actually do that? So at its kind of most basic, feedback is just data flowing between people. However, given there are humans involved, that data isn't necessarily guaranteed to arrive in the same way it was sent. So feedback is given with intention, but it's received with impact. Our intention for giving feedback is based on our particular context, our view of the world, and it's built through our thoughts and feelings about a situation. And all of which contribute really to what we deliver and how we deliver it. The impact, though, as to how it's received for the other person is based on their perception and their view of the world. And it's formed in the thoughts and feelings that they experience when they receive that feedback. And to lessen the chances, really, of the value being lost somewhere in the gap between the two, we need to give some thought to how we're going to construct and deliver that feedback if we're giving feedback, and also to how we interpret that feedback if we're receiving it. So let's look at our first recipe, a recipe for how to construct feedback. And you can use this process to kind of think about how to construct a feedback that's likely to land better with people. And I think of this as see, think, feel. And here's how it works. So you start with what I saw or heard was, and then you be specific. Then move on to what I inferred from that was, and here's where you can state your thinking and assumptions. The impact on me was, and then you can share how you felt about the situation. And finally, my intention in giving you this feedback is, and then you can actually share why it's valuable to share the feedback. So, if we delve into that in a little bit more detail, by being specific about what you observed, you're aiming to give people the detail, the data in its raw form, so they're able to interpret it for themselves. By sharing what you inferred from that, you're sharing your perception and also your context. How has it affected you, and what have you taken from this? By sharing the impact, you're letting them know how it felt to you, which is both powerful and also authentic. No one can kind of question how it impacted you personally. And finally, by sharing your intention, you're letting them know why you think this is valuable for both you and also for them, potentially. What if you're on the other side of the conversation, however, and you're receiving that feedback? Let's have a look at a second recipe now as to how you can reflect more kind of calmly and fully on any feedback you receive using this kind of 3-step process, or ABC really. So A stands for activating event or situation. So what did you see or hear? This is the facts ideally from your recollection of the situation, but perhaps it's just as shared with you by the person giving you the feedback. And again, good to ask some clarifying questions if you need here. Moving on to B, having heard the detail, what are your beliefs about this? What are you thinking about that situation? But then it's important to actually kind of question these. Are they actually true? Are they actually helpful? Perhaps this, maybe they're preventing you from seeing things from a different kind of perspective. And then what are the consequences? C, what are the consequences of this? What's the impact of thinking or continuing to believe these things are true? And that's absolutely an option. It may be that the other person just has a different point of view, but considering, well, what are the consequences? And maybe if they're sharing something with you, is that valuable for you to consider? Note, other recipes are available, of course. So if those 2 different recipes didn't resonate with you, come and chat to me in the break afterwards and I can share with you some other types of ways of constructing feedback from some of these great sources, for example. So we've set our table and we've looked at some of the recipes to kind of help us give and receive feedback. How do we now kind of build this up into a more of an overall menu to kind of encourage a culture where feedback flows effectively and is also useful both to individuals and the organisation? So what I wanted to do now really was share some of the different things we tried at a company called Infinity Works, which was a tech consultancy I joined as a startup back in 2015, which then grew to around 500 people before being acquired by Accenture in 2021. So, first course, a starter as it were, think sushi or tapas, something that I like to call kind of peer-to-peer micro-feedback. So when we were initially trying to encourage a feedback culture, we didn't think of feedback really as an event, but more as a flow of information, something that's happening directly between peers. This was something that was happening all the time. And it was delivered exactly when it was happening so that people still could remember the details and the specifics of what was being going on. And so rather than focusing on any kind of formal mechanisms initially, we rolled out training on how to give and receive feedback effectively. So some recipes similar to what I shared before. And then we encouraged people to go and try it out all the time, to kind of look out for any sort of little events which were happening and observations that they would make and share these with the members of other members on their teams. And equally, to ask for feedback regularly in day-to-day work within your team. So, a great starter, but not really enough for a main course. Now, why was that? Well, especially as the company began to grow and we employed people at loads of different sort of career stages and levels, people were also keen to understand how they were doing overall, how they were developing and progressing and how they could improve. So our main course, as it were, is kind of feedback at the team level. So we encouraged teams to kind of implement different mechanisms, and different teams took different approaches. But one particularly successful one was this idea of speedback. And what happened with this was 1 or 2 members of the team would be the focus for feedback over a given period, like a week or a fortnight. And everyone else in the team would focus on what those people were doing and kind of aim to provide both constructive and positive feedback to them at the end of the period. That was one-on-one, still peer-to-peer, and then it rotated around the team over time. So we've got feedback flowing peer-to-peer, and we've also now got it at the team level. Another course, or perhaps more of a maitre d', checking in that everything's going okay, was provided through what we called our advocacy model. Everybody at Infinity Works had what was called an advocate to support them, and that wasn't somebody that was hierarchically in charge of them, but was there to provide support, potentially through coaching, mentoring, and being a sounding board and all those things. And this gave many more opportunities for kind of more in-depth conversations. They weren't typically in a place to provide feedback directly themselves, as often they weren't on the same team as that person, but they were able to broker it if required, so to check in that that person was receiving feedback and had everything else in place that they needed to progress. And then finally, going with my metaphor for the final time, the dessert course, or cheese if you wish, was something that I'm sure more people will be familiar with, and that was the opportunity to have a more formal quarterly review. And while we were initially a little bit hesitant to implement something like this based on sort of past bad experiences, we found that people did appreciate an opportunity for a more formal conversation. Something that was happening with somebody more senior, somebody with some degree of influence as to whether you might be promoted, for example. And really it was an opportunity to discuss career progression. How are you doing and how could I move forward, kind of thing. We used a tool to kind of allow people to both ask for and provide written sort of 360 feedback to feed into that process, which then formed the basis of a kind of conversation. So as we step out of our feedback restaurant, I wanted to finish really with the thought that if this all sounds like something that's a domain of like L&D or HR, and very different from that sort of day-to-day business of delivering, personally I'd argue that there's a high degree of overlap between a culture that genuinely cares about helping individuals grow and improve through feedback and other mechanisms, and what's required for high-performing teams. And that is a culture where people are encouraged to experiment, to share learning, and to continuously improve. And by being able to provide feedback in a safe and effective way is a crucial part of doing so. So that's the end of the talk, but given we have a little bit more time, I wanted to invite you to participate in a little bit of an exercise now. An exercise to create, wait for it, the worst feedback restaurant of all time. So somewhere where we have the worst possible feedback culture. And here's how it's going to work. So in pairs or threes, I'm going to ask people to pass back some post-its. If you've got things to write on as well, that's great. Yeah, if you could just sort of share those out. So in pairs or threes, I'd like you to spend some time, 4 minutes exactly, to be fair, answering the question, how could you create the worst possible feedback culture? And this is based on a kind of reverse brainstorm technique, or it's also known as TRIZ from the Liberating Structures. And the idea is to make it as terrible as possible. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to do that, have a conversation, and make a list of the things that you feel would make the worst possible feedback culture. Let's just hear a couple of things that people came up with. How could you create the worst feedback culture? Shout out a few suggestions.
Pay benefit.
Sorry?
Your pay is dependent on your feedback.
Pay is dependent on feedback. Wow, brilliant, brilliant. Something else?
Casual.
Casual. Yeah. Just totally casual feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, like it doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter. Brilliant. Yep. Anything else? Yep.
No actionable steps.
Nothing actionable. Great. Yep.
Delivered months later.
Sorry, I missed that. Yeah.
Delivered months later.
Delivered months later. Yeah. Well, let's go even further. Years later. Yeah. Go on, one more, Richard.
Observation versus interpretation. So them saying like, I don't know, you fell asleep in that meeting, or it looked like you did, versus I was just, I don't know.
Yep, just your view on
Myself
things.
or something.
This is how it works. Yep.
Trying to visualise.
Yeah. Brilliant. Right, obviously I don't want to end there though and leave you with terrible suggestions. So, step 2 of the exercise, so back in your pairs again, and another 3 or 4 minutes. What are you currently doing, in whatever context kind of makes sense for you, whether that's where you work right now or some other context, that kind of resembles, even in a little bit of a way, something on your first list. And then note that down as a second list. I'll give you, again, conscious of time, 3 minutes to do that. I'm going to stop you again. So I'm realising I'm probably shouting into my microphone here, which is going to do wonders for the recording. So, right, very conscious of time now, and I'm not going to ask people to share what you've come up with there. Instead, I'm going to ask you to do the final step. Which is this. What's the first step you could take to stop doing what you know creates undesirable results? So from your second list, is there anything that you could do? What is the first step that you can do that's actionable, that's meaningful, to kind of stop doing those results? 2 minutes finally to do that. I'm conscious of the glare of Marcus. Final time. I'm very conscious I'm between you and the break now. So, anybody briefly want to share something they came up with as a step they could take to stop doing something that's not good? John, thank you.
Don't give it on a Friday afternoon because it's something.
Fantastic. Actionable, meaningful, impactful first step. Yes?
Ask them what sort of feedback, when do they want it, whom they, basically you should be able to dictate that too.
Brilliant. Yep, fantastic.
Ask more questions.
Ask more questions, thank you. And over here?
Acknowledge that there are things to stop to address.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so absolutely acknowledging that things could be improved and that there are things that we could stop. Great. Right, well, thank you very much for listening. And of course, do come and chat to me in the break if you've got any questions, or of course, if you've got any feedback. It would be very ironic if I didn't say that. So thank you very much.